My name is Loretta Me Calloway. I am 37 years old. And the night my father told me my grandmother's estate had already been settled, he was standing in the kitchen she had cooked in for 41 years, wearing a watch she had given him, eating off plates she had bought at a church sale in 1987. He said it the way you say the weather is going to be warm tomorrow, matter of fact, final. He did not look up from his plate. I had driven 6 hours from Raleigh to get there. I had taken 2 days off work. I had a casserole dish in my hands that I had made the night before because my grandmother always said you do not show up to family empty-handed, and even though she had been gone for 11 days, I was not ready to stop honoring what she taught me. I set the casserole dish on the counter. I did not say anything, and I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. Staying quiet in that moment was not weakness. It was the most deliberate thing I have ever done in my life. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Now let me tell you about my grandmother's porch. It faced west, which meant that in the evenings the light came in sideways and turned everything amber. The rocking chairs, the hydrangea bushes she kept along the railing, the glass of sweet tea she always had sitting on the small wicker table by her left hand. The porch was in Harnett County, North Carolina, about 11 miles outside of Lillington, on a piece of land that had been in our family since my great-grandfather bought it in 1951 for $2,300 cash. 42 acres, a farmhouse that had been added onto 3 separate times, a back bedroom in the 1960s when my father and my uncle were born close together, a sunroom in the 1970s that nobody really used but that my grandmother kept swept and clean anyway because she said a room you keep clean is a room that knows it is still valued. And a mudroom off the kitchen that my grandfather had built himself in 1983, the year before he retired from the feed store, because he wanted something to do with his hands, and she had wanted a place to leave her garden boots without tracking soil across the kitchen floor. There was also a smokehouse. Nobody used it anymore. My grandmother refused to tear it down because her mother had cured hams in it, and she said you do not demolish a thing just because it has gone quiet. Her name was Opal Lenore Calloway. She went by Miss Opal to everyone in the county except her grandchildren, who called her Grandma, and her oldest friends, who called her Lenny, which was a name from childhood that nobody had explained to me and that I never asked about because some things belong to the people who were there, and asking about them is like reaching through a window that was not meant for you to open. I spent every summer of my childhood on that porch, every summer from when I was 4 years old until I left for college at 18, 14 summers. I know the sound that porch makes when the weather changes, a low creak from the floorboard third from the door, a slightly higher note from the screen door when you open it if the humidity is above a certain level, which in Harnett County between June and August is most of the time. I know the way the hydrangeas smell after rain, which is different from how they smell in dry heat, something greener in the rain smell, something heavier. I know that the rocking chair on the left rocks slightly faster than the one on the right because one of the legs was repaired with a different wood sometime in the 1970s, and my grandmother never had it evened out. She said it reminded her to slow down. That was the kind of woman she was. She found a reason to be grateful for the things that were slightly broken. She kept a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, tomatoes and butter beans and okra, and a row of marigolds along the outside edge that she said kept the pests back. Every morning in the summer, she was out there before 7, in her garden shoes and her old canvas hat, moving through the rows the way she moved through everything, without hurry, with complete attention. She would come back inside with whatever she had picked, and she would wash it at the sink, and then she would stand at the counter and look at what she had and decide what it wanted to become. That is how she cooked. Not from a recipe usually, from looking at what was there. She taught me to do the same thing, not just with food, with everything. She was 81 years old when she died. She had been healthy most of her life, the kind of healthy that comes from physical work and plain food and sleeping. When the sun goes down, she had started to slow in her last 2 years, not dramatically, just the way a river slows as it gets closer to where it is going to rest. She moved more carefully, she sat down more, she held my hand a little longer when I visited, which was 6 or 7 times a year more when I could manage it. The last time I saw her was in March, about 4 months before she died. I drove up from Raleigh on a Saturday, left at 6 in the morning so I could get there before noon. She was standing on the porch when I pulled in the driveway, which she always did when she knew I was coming. She had her canvas hat on even though it was only March and the sun was still thin. She was watching my car come up the long, flat gravel drive, and she had her hands at her sides and she was smiling. She had made chicken and dumplings, which she always made when I visited, even though she had to stand at the stove for 45 minutes to do it, and I had told her 100 times she did not have to. She waved me off every time. She said a woman feeds the people she loves, and that is the end of the discussion. I learned not to argue about it. Some positions are not meant to be moved. We ate lunch at the kitchen table and talked about ordinary things. Her neighbor, Bet Simmons, had just had her hip replaced and was recovering at her daughter's house in Sanford. The tomato seeds she had ordered from the catalog had come in, and she was going to start them in the window boxes in 2 weeks if the nighttime temperatures held steady. My cousin Tina had a new baby, a boy, and she had been up to see him twice already, and she said he had her grandfather's ears, wide and flat and set a little high, which she said as though it were the highest compliment. She asked about my job, which is bookkeeping, and she asked the same questions she always asked. How are the clients? Is the office warm enough in winter? Are you eating lunch and not just working through it? I told her yes to all of it, some of it was true. After lunch, we moved to the porch. The afternoon was mild for March, the kind of day that arrives in the South as a promise that is not quite a promise, warm enough that you do not need a coat but cool enough that you do not take it off all the way. She had her sweet tea, I had mine. The hydrangeas had just started to send up the first green growth along the dead wood from winter. The pecan tree at the far edge of the yard was still bare, but you could see the swelling at the tips of the branches, where the buds were getting ready. We talked about the garden some more. We talked about what she was going to plant differently this year. She had decided to give up on the bell peppers, she said, because the soil on that side of the garden had gotten too acid no matter what she did to it, and she was tired of fighting it. She was going to put in more basil instead and let the basil have the whole bed. She said sometimes you have to stop trying to make a thing work and just plant what wants to be there. At some point in the late afternoon, she went quiet for a little while and we just rocked. The light was coming in sideways the way it does, and the hydrangeas had that first green on them, and the air smelled like warming dirt and new growth, and something faintly sweet that might have been the Bradford pear at the side of the house, or might have just been the particular smell of that property in early spring, which I have never smelled anywhere else. She said, without turning to look at me, Loretta, I need you to trust that I have taken care of things. I looked at her, she was still facing forward, looking out at the yard. I said, what things, Grandma? She said, all of it, the things that matter, I have taken care of them. I watched her face for a moment. She had a particular expression that I had seen before and could never quite name. Not worry, not sadness. Something more like a person who has decided something and is at peace with the deciding, the way someone looks when they have finished a letter they have been trying to write for a long time. I said, okay. She said, I know you don't always push, Loretta. I know that about you, and I want you to know I have always appreciated it. Not everyone understands that patience is a skill. Not everyone sees it in you. I see it in you. I did not know what to say to that, so I said, I learned it from you. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh. Then she looked at me just briefly, and her eyes were very clear and steady. Then she looked back out at the yard. She said, when the time comes, you will know what to look for. I started to ask what she meant, and she made a small motion with one hand, not dismissive, more like a period at the end of a sentence. So I let it rest. We sat there until the sun went all the way down. She brought out more sweet tea once and a plate of ginger snaps she had made that morning. We ate them slowly. The yard went from gold to gray to dark. The first crickets started up somewhere in the field beyond the fence. She said, I am tired, baby girl. I am going to go on in. I walked her inside. I kissed her cheek in the kitchen. She smelled like the hand lotion she always kept by the sink, something faintly floral that I have never identified in a store, but that is specifically and only her. She held my hand at the back door for a moment and squeezed it once. I drove back to Raleigh that night. I got home after midnight. I sat in the car in the parking lot of my building for a few minutes before I went in. I was not thinking about anything in particular, or I was thinking about too many things to separate them out. My chest felt full in a way that was not comfortable but was not grief either, more like something being pressed gently into a smaller space. That was the last real conversation I had with her. I want to tell you about my uncle before I tell you what happened after she died, because you need to understand who he is to understand what he did. My Uncle Daryl is my father's younger brother. He is 54 years old and he has lived in the farmhouse for the past 9 years, since his divorce from his first wife, Connie, who left him and moved to Charlotte and whose name is not spoken at family gatherings in a tone that suggests anyone is particularly sorry she is gone. Before the divorce, he had been living in a rental house in Dunn and working in sales for a farm equipment company. He had never been good at staying in one place. He had never been good at much that required patience. He moved into the farmhouse to help take care of my grandmother after my grandfather died. That was the arrangement. That was how it was explained to everyone, including my grandmother, who accepted it the way she accepted most things that arrived in her life with a complicated price tag, not with complaint, not with gratitude exactly, just with acknowledgement. What I know now and what I did not know clearly then is that the arrangement was Daryl's idea from the beginning. He proposed it. He framed it as sacrifice, as family duty, as the right thing for a son to do for an aging mother. He let people believe he had given something up to be there, and people were grateful to believe it because it meant they did not have to do it themselves. My father was 3 hours away in Durham. My aunts were scattered. Daryl being there was convenient for everyone, which is a fact he knew and used. What he got in return was a place to live for free, use of the property and the equipment and the outbuildings, and 9 years of proximity to a woman who owned 42 acres in a county where land was no longer cheap. Daryl is the kind of man who talks about family constantly. Family is everything. Blood is blood. He says these things the way some people say grace by habit without thinking about what the words mean. He coaches a youth baseball team in the spring. He goes to First Baptist on Sundays, not every Sunday, but enough Sundays that people know his name and nod when they see him. He has a good handshake and he remembers things about people, their kids' names, their truck make, their last hunting season, what they had going on the last time he saw them. People like him because he pays attention to them. What I did not understand for a long time is that paying attention is not the same thing as caring. My grandmother was not fooled by him. I know this now. I believe I knew it then and chose not to look at it directly because looking at it directly would have required me to do something about it, and I was not sure yet what to do, and my grandmother had always said that acting before you know what you're doing is worse than waiting. Here is what I mean. At the Harnett County Fair in August of 2019, which was 2 summers before my grandmother died, I was there on a Saturday afternoon with my mother who had driven down from Durham for the weekend. We had been at the fair maybe 2 hours when we found my grandmother at one of the picnic tables near the funnel cake stand, which was where she always sat because she liked to watch people walk by and because the bench had a back on it and by August she needed the support. Daryl was there too. He was standing maybe 20 feet away talking to some men I did not know, laughing at something completely at ease. My grandmother was watching him talk. She had a paper cup of lemonade in both hands and she was watching her youngest son the way you watch a weather vane, just taking information, not warm, not cold, observational. I sat down next to her and she did not look away from him. She said, quiet enough that only I could hear, "Your uncle is a very attentive man." I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Attentive men sometimes want something for their attention." She paused. She said, "The question is always what?" She said it plainly, no heat in it, like she was telling me the price of sweet corn. I did not answer, and she did not seem to expect me to. After a moment, she turned and looked at me and smiled the way she smiled when she was checking to see if you had heard her correctly. I gave her a small nod. She picked up her lemonade and took a sip. My mother came back with funnel cake, and the conversation was over. That was 2019. I turned it over in my mind on the drive back to Raleigh. I thought about it several times over the following months. I thought about it more after my grandfather died and then again when Daryl moved into the farmhouse. But I did not do anything with it because I did not yet know what doing something would look like, and my grandmother had not asked me to do anything. She had just made sure I noticed. My grandmother died on a Wednesday in July of 2021. She went in her sleep in her own bed in her own house, which was what she had told me she wanted. She said she wanted to die looking at her own ceiling, which was the same ceiling she had been looking at for 40 years, and she got that. My father called me that morning. He was crying, and I could hear Daryl in the background handling things, talking to someone on another phone, already moving. I drove up that same day. I got there by late afternoon. The house was already full of people, neighbors and church friends and some family members I only see at funerals, people who arrive at grief with purpose, who know where the paper plates are and how to direct traffic and how to make 4 pounds of potato salad appear from nothing. Daryl was at the center of it, receiving condolences, directing people, explaining things. He had made coffee. He had put out the pound cake that the woman from next door had brought over and arranged the paper plates beside it, and found the serving spatula, and everything was moving. He looked sad. He looked like a son who had lost his mother and was holding himself together for everyone else. People kept patting his arm. He accepted it with the practiced ease of a man who has always known how to be seen. My father was in the living room looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He is 68 years old, my father. He and Daryl look alike, but they are not alike. My father is soft-spoken and takes a long time to form opinions. He trusts people he has known a long time, which is the way he was raised, and he trusted Daryl because Daryl was his brother and had been in the house and had, by all appearances, taken care of their mother. I sat with my father for a while. I held his hand. He told me she had gone peacefully and that she had not been in pain and that she had looked okay the night before when he had called to check on her. His voice broke on the word okay. I rubbed the back of his hand and did not try to fix it. I got him a plate of food and made sure he ate some of it, and then I walked through the house slowly, the way you do when someone is gone and the house is still full of them. The particular weight of a house in the first days, everything still in its place. The dish towels still on the oven handle, the mug in the drying rack, her reading glasses on the kitchen counter next to a little pile of mail she had not gotten to. Her bedroom door was closed. I did not go in that day. The thing I want to tell you about, the thing that is important to the rest of this story, is the Bible. My grandmother had a family Bible, not the kind you keep on a shelf to show people. The kind you actually use, the kind that lives beside you, that you reach for in the dark on bad nights, that you carry to church even though you know every word in it. It was large, bound in dark brown leather that had gone soft from decades of handling. It had a brass clasp on the side that she kept fastened. The pages inside had her handwriting in the margins. Her mother's handwriting, her grandmother's handwriting, 3 generations of women leaving small marks beside verses that had stopped them. There were grocery lists tucked between pages, a folded newspaper clipping from 1977 that I had looked at once as a child and could not remember clearly now, a pressed flower between waxed paper from her wedding in 1962, dried flat and amber, still recognizable as a magnolia. The front page had the family record. Names and birth dates and marriage dates and death dates in several different hands, the oldest entries faded to gray, the newest in my grandmother's blue ink. She updated it herself. Every time there was a birth, she added the name. She had added my name when I was born, Loretta Me Calloway, June 3, 1987, and she had shown me once, when I was about 9 years old, shown me my name in the Bible and said, "You are in here and you are going to stay in here, and that is something no one can take from you." That Bible lived on the nightstand next to her bed. It had been there my entire life. It was the last thing she read at night and the first thing she reached for in the morning. I do not believe she had ever spent a night away from it in 40 years. When I finally went back to the farmhouse a week after the funeral, for the family gathering my father had organized, the Bible was not on the nightstand. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that has stopped. Not alarm, not immediately. Just a gap where something should be, a silence where something had always been present. I did not ask about it that day. I moved through the gathering, I ate, I talked to people. I watched Daryl stand in the kitchen of his dead mother's house with his coffee and his condolences and his easy management of everyone around him. I watched him and I kept the noticing in a small, careful place inside my chest, and I did not let it out. And then my father told me the estate had been settled. He said it in that kitchen. He was eating a plate of food someone had brought, cutting a piece of cornbread, and he said, "Your grandmother's will was filed last month. Daryl handled all of it. There's nothing to worry about." I said, "What does that mean exactly, Daddy? I know you said the will was final. I just want to understand what we're talking about." He set the knife down. He looked at me with a kind of patient weariness, not unkind, just the weariness of a man who has already processed something and does not want to go back through it. He said, "It means what it means, Loretta. Your uncle was here. He took care of her. The house and the land go to him." I said, "All 42 acres. He said that is what she wanted." I said, "Okay." I picked up the empty casserole dish and I washed it in the sink. The water was warm. The dish soap was the same kind she had always kept, lemon yellow, the dollar store bottle. I stood there with my hands in the soapy water and I thought, she told me in March that she had taken care of things. She used those exact words. She was a precise woman who did not say things she did not mean. She said things the way she planted her garden, deliberately and with full attention to what she was putting in the ground. The water ran warm over my hands. The dish was clean and I kept washing it anyway just to stay in that spot for another moment. Something behind my collarbone went still and careful. Not cold, not hot, just deliberate. The way I get when a set of books does not balance and I know there is something in there and I have to find it. I dried the casserole dish and I put it in my bag. I said goodbye to my father and told him to call me if he needed anything. I said goodbye to Daryl, who was on the porch talking to the baseball coach from his youth team, and he gave me a hug that felt like a period at the end of a sentence he had already written. I hugged him back with the same amount of feeling, which was none at all. I drove the 6 hours back to Raleigh. That night I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and I wrote down what I knew and what I did not know and what I needed to find out. That is how I work when something is wrong. I do not get loud about it. I do not call people or compare notes or make accusations out loud to anyone who will listen. I sit down with a blank page and I start from the beginning. What I knew, my grandmother had told me specifically 4 months before she died that she had taken care of things. She had said it as a statement she wanted me to hold on to. She had checked to see that I heard her. She had told me that when the time came, I would know what to look for. She was a woman who did not say things without purpose. She would not have said those things and then left me with nothing. What I did not know, when the will my father was describing had been drawn up, whether it was the only will, whether my grandmother had her own attorney separate from anyone Daryl had access to, who else she might have talked to, where the Bible was. What I needed to find out, all of it. I wrote that down and then I sat for a while longer. Outside my window it was August in Raleigh and the city was making its nighttime sounds, distant traffic, a dog somewhere, a neighbor's air conditioning unit starting and stopping. My apartment was cool and quiet. I had a glass of water on the table that I kept picking up and putting down without drinking. I thought about her on that porch, the specific weight of that late afternoon. She had been satisfied, she had been at peace with something, a woman who had finished what she was doing and was ready to rest. She had also, I thought very carefully, trusted me to do something specific. I did not know what. Yet, but she had trusted me. That was enough to work with. I went to Harnett County the following weekend. I did not tell anyone I was going. I drove down Saturday morning and went first to the Register of Deeds office when it opened at 9. The clerk was a young woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she was helpful without being curious, which was exactly what I needed. I looked up the property record for the farmhouse. 42 acres, recorded in my grandmother's name since my grandfather's death in 2009. There was a transfer pending. It had been initiated 11 days after her death. 11 days. I wrote that down on my legal pad. I wrote it down carefully and I did not let myself respond to it emotionally in that office. Later, I thought, deal with what it means later. I went to the Harnett County Courthouse next and I asked for the probate filing. The clerk found it without any trouble. The will had been filed and was available as a public record. It was a single page, typed, not handwritten, signed and notarized. The notary was a woman named Patricia Doyle. The date on the document was March 14, 2021. March 14, 2021. 4 months before my grandmother died, the same month I had visited, the same afternoon possibly that we had sat on the porch, that she had said she had taken care of things. I read the document twice at the counter, standing up, leaning over the copy the clerk had placed in front of me, my grandmother's name typed at the top. The language was simple: leave the property, the land, the house, and all personal effects to Daryl Wayne Calloway, my son, in recognition of his care and service. Her signature below it, Opal L. Calloway, the capital O with the long loop and the L close beside it. It looked like her signature. The handwriting of it was right, but the language of the document was not her voice. I know how my grandmother expressed herself. I know it from 14 summers and 6 or 7 visits a year for 15 years of adulthood and birthday cards and 2 real letters and 1 conversation on a porch in March where she chose every word with the care of a woman who has thought about what she is leaving behind. She would not have said in recognition of his care and service. She would have said, Daryl was here when I needed him and the house should go to him because of it. She would not have made it sound like a legal brief. She would not have used the word recognition. She also would not have left without a word for me. That thought arrived quietly and sat down. My grandmother was a woman who did not leave without saying what needed to be said. The March conversation was proof of that. She had been specific and deliberate, and she had checked to see that I understood. She would not have left me nothing else. I stood at the courthouse counter for another moment. The clerk was at her desk doing something on her computer. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. Then I picked up my legal pad and I thanked the clerk and I walked outside. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot and I looked at what I had written: 11 days to file, a will that did not sound like her, a date in March that matched my visit, a notary from a UPS store on Highway 421. I went to the library in Lillington and used their computer. I looked up the state bar directory for North Carolina. I was looking for attorneys in Dunn and the surrounding area, specifically women, specifically anyone who might have done estate work for an 81-year-old woman who would have wanted someone careful and quiet and not connected to her son. I wrote down 4 names, then I thought about what Bet Simmons might know. I was going to get to Bet, but first there was one more thing I needed to check. I drove back to the courthouse and I asked to see any other filings connected to my grandmother's estate. The clerk looked at me for a moment and then looked at the computer and then looked back at me and said, "There is a notice of contest that was filed last week." I said, "By whom?" She looked at the screen. She said it was filed by an attorney in Dunn, a Renata Ashworth. Something in my chest went very quiet. I said, "Do you have contact information for that attorney?" She said it would be on the filing. She printed me a copy. Renata Ashworth, attorney at law, 112 Magnolia Street, Suite 2, Dunn, North Carolina. Phone number, a date of filing just 8 days ago. I sat with that for a moment, then I wrote it down. I drove to see Bet Simmons. Bet Simmons was my grandmother's nearest neighbor, her house about a quarter mile up the same road, and she had been my grandmother's closest friend for 30 years. She was 78 years old and she had come back from her daughter's house in Sanford by then, her hip mostly healed, walking carefully with a cane. But back in her own house and back in her own routines, which you could tell she was glad of. She had a little vegetable garden of her own and a screened porch with a glider on it, and a tabby cat named Governor who had been with her for 11 years and walked across your feet when you sat down. I brought pound cake from the bakery on Main Street in Lillington because my grandmother would have wanted it, and some things you do not stop doing just because the person who taught you is gone. Bet let me in and she poured us each a glass of sweet tea before we had even sat down all the way, which was the right thing to do and I was grateful for it. Governor came and walked across my feet and then settled under the coffee table. We talked about my grandmother for a while. Bet told me about the last few months. My grandmother had been slower but sharp, she said, sharp as a tack right to the end. She was tired and she moved carefully, but her mind was clear and she knew what was happening and she said what she meant the same as she always had. Bet paused, she looked at her tea. She said, "You know your grandmother was a private woman." I said, "I know she was." She set her glass down. She said, "There are things I can say and things I probably should not say, and what I can say is this. Your grandmother went to see an attorney in Dunn twice that I know of. She went in the spring before she started slowing down. I drove her both times because Daryl had her car and she did not want to ask him for it for that particular errand." I said, "Which attorney?" She said, "A woman named Renata Ashworth. She has the office above the coffee shop on Magnolia Street." I wrote the name down even though I already had it. Writing it again helped me feel like the world had edges. Bet picked her tea back up, she held it in both hands. She said, "I will tell you one more thing and then I'm going to let you carry it where it needs to go." When she came back from that second appointment, she was quiet the whole drive home. Didn't say a word from the parking lot all the way to the driveway, but when I pulled in, she put her hand on my arm and she said, "Bet the right things are in the right places." She said it very sure of herself, not tired, sure. Then she got out and went inside. I held that for a moment. The right things are in the right places. I said, "Bet, what happened to her Bibles?" Bet looked at me for a long moment. With her steady gray eyes, outside on the porch, Governor was batting at something through the screen. The afternoon was moving slow and hot the way August afternoons in Harnett County move. She said she gave it to me. I felt something leave the bottom of my chest and come back up slowly. Bet said about a month before she died. She brought it over in a paper grocery bag, just walked over herself with that bag under her arm, and she said, "Bet, I need you to keep this for a while." She said Loretta will come asking for it. When she does, you give it to her. Then she turned around and walked back home. That was all she said, no explanation, no asking if I had questions. She knew I didn't have questions because she knew I understood. Bet got up from her chair. She moved carefully with her cane to the back bedroom, and I sat there with my hands in my lap, and Governor came out from under the coffee table and looked at me for a long moment and then went back under. The afternoon was very quiet. There was a fan running somewhere in the back of the house. Bet came back with the Bible, the dark brown leather, soft from decades of handling, the brass clasp on the side. She carried it in both hands, level and deliberate, and she set it on the cushion next to me. I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected. Or maybe I had just not held it in many years and had forgotten what a book full of history weighs. The brass clasp opened with the same small click it had always made. My hands remembered it before I did. Inside the front cover were the names. My great-grandmother Nola Jean Pickett, born 1899, my great-grandfather Roy Calloway, born 1897, below them their children, then my grandmother's name Opal Lenore Pickett Calloway, born 1940, then her children, then the grandchildren. My name was there in blue ink, slightly smudged at the right edge the way her writing sometimes was when the pen moved faster than it should. Loretta Me Calloway, born June 3, 1987. I ran my thumb along the edge of my name. The paper was worn where it had been turned past countless times. The ink was set deep. I turned pages slowly, the margin notes I had known about my whole life, small pencil marks beside verses, dates with no explanation, a word or two, November 1943 beside a verse in Job, a tiny cross in Psalms with nothing written next to it, just the cross, just the mark of someone stopping there, a verse in Proverbs. With my grandmother's handwriting in the margin, just the word yes, nothing else, and the date 1978. In the middle of the Bible, between the last page of the Old Testament and the first page of the New, there was an envelope. White, letter-sized, sealed. My name on the front in her handwriting, not my full name, just Loretta. The capital L the way she had always made it, strong downstroke and a long bottom foot. I held it for a moment. Bet was sitting quietly in her chair looking out toward the yard. Governor had reappeared and was sitting at my feet with his tail moving slowly. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, front and back of each, her handwriting, real and unmistakable, and a business card from Renata Ashworth, attorney at law, with a phone number written on the back in my grandmother's hand and a date in April. I read the letter sitting in Bet Simmons' living room in August heat with the fan running in the back and Governor at my feet, and Bet looking out at her yard. She started by saying, Loretta, if you are reading this then you went looking, which means you knew something was not right, which means I raised you correctly after all. She said that once, years ago, she had believed that family could be trusted simply because it was family, and that one of the things getting older had taught her was that trust is not something you inherit, it is something you earn, and not everyone in a family does the work of earning it. She said she had drawn up a proper will with Renata Ashworth in April of 2021. She said she had signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses who were not family and had no connection to Daryl or to the property. She said Renata had the original and had been instructed to watch for any competing filing and to act on her behalf. She said the will left the farmhouse and 20 acres to Daryl. She said she was willing to give him that because he had been there and she acknowledged it even knowing what had driven him to be there. She said she was not a woman who could look at someone who had given 9 years of his life for whatever reason and leave him nothing. But she said 20 acres and the house was what she was willing to give and not a foot more. The remaining 22 acres, the back acreage with the creek running through it and the pecan grove her father had planted in 1955, went to my father and to me jointly. She said the pecan grove was older than Daryl and it would be there long after all of us, and she wanted it to belong to people who would leave it standing. She said there was also a savings account at Four Oaks Bank in Lillington with $67,000 in it that Daryl did not know existed. She had been building it for 11 years by selling timber from the back 40 selectively and quietly, working with a forestry management company out of Johnston County who had agreed to keep their dealings private. She said she had started it the year she began to understand what Daryl's presence in her house was likely to cost her in the long run, and she had been careful and patient about it because she had known it would take time. She said $67,000 does not sound like much to some people. It is 11 years of careful work and it is everything I could protect. It goes to you and your father equally. She said I knew Daryl would move fast after I was gone. I knew him well enough to know he would file something before anyone had time to ask questions. What I did not know is exactly how he would do it, but I prepared for it and Renata has been ready. She said the reason I am giving you to look is this: the right things are in the right places, which is something I told Bet to make sure got back to you. She said I am not asking you to fight your uncle in a way that tears the family apart. I am asking you to make sure the truth is on the record. My truth, what I actually wanted, not what someone else decided I wanted. There is a difference between those two things, and I have spent 81 years believing that difference matters. She said, I love you, baby girl. You have always been the one in this family who watches and waits and does the right thing even when it would be easier and louder to do something else. I have always been proud of that in you even when it looked to the outside like you were not doing anything at all. You were always doing something. You were paying attention. That is everything. She signed it Grandma Opal, the O with the long loop, the way she had always signed herself to me. I read the letter twice. I read it the way I read a set of books that finally add up, slowly and with complete attention, making sure I had not missed anything. Bet was still looking out at her yard. The afternoon was very still. Governor had gone to sleep at my feet. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope back inside the Bible in the same place it had been. Then I sat for a moment with the Bible in my lap, its weight, its warmth, the brass clasp under my thumb. I said, Bet, thank you. She looked at me then, her eyes were steady. She said, Your grandmother knew what she was doing. I said, Yes, ma'am, she always did. I picked up the Bible and I put it in my bag. I stood up and Governor moved out of the way without complaint. I said I was going to let Bet get back to her afternoon, and she walked me to the door, and we stood for a moment on her porch, which also faced west, and the light was coming in sideways and gold the same way it came in on my grandmother's porch. She said, Loretta, your grandmother loved you especially. I hope you know that. I said, I know it. She squeezed my arm once. I went to my car. I drove to Dunn that same afternoon. Renata Ashworth's office was above a coffee shop on Magnolia Street, exactly where Bet had said. It was Saturday, so the office was closed, but there was a number on the door for urgent matters. I called it from the sidewalk. It rang 3 times. She answered on the 4th ring and said, Renata Ashworth. I said, My name is Loretta Calloway. I'm Opal Calloway's granddaughter. I have her letter and her business card, and I need to speak with you. She was quiet for about 2 seconds. Then she said, I have been waiting for this call for 2 months. I'm 10 minutes away. Can you wait? I said yes, and I sat on the bench outside the coffee shop, and I held my grandmother's Bible in my lap, and I looked at the street of Dunn, North Carolina on a Saturday afternoon in August, the storefronts, the pickup trucks, the late summer heat sitting on everything. I had been in this town 100 times in my life and had never sat on this particular bench before. It felt like a thing my grandmother had arranged, not mysteriously, just practically the way she arranged everything. Renata Ashworth was 46 years old, a small, precise woman with natural hair and reading glasses on a chain, and the particular calm of someone who has been doing this long enough to stop being surprised by what families do to each other. She led us into the office and made coffee, and we sat at the small, round table she kept for client meetings, which had a window that looked down at the street and a spider plant on the sill that was thriving. She confirmed everything in the letter. She had the signed will. She had the 2 witness signatures, women from her church, retired, no connection to the Calloway family. She had a notarized copy in her files and the original in a locked drawer. She had seen the competing filing and had already begun the formal contest process. The notice had been filed 8 days ago. She said, I want to tell you something about the document your uncle filed. I said, please. She set her coffee mug down. She said, I cannot speak to how it came to exist because I was not there. What I can tell you is that there is a significant problem with it. The notary, Patricia Doyle, she works out of the UPS store on 421. That is a legitimate notary. That is not itself the issue. The issue is the date. The document is dated March 14, 2021. Your grandmother signed my will on March 14, 2021 at 10:47 in the morning. I have a sign-in log with her signature, a timestamp, and 2 witness signatures. She was in this office at this table at 10:47 in the morning on that date. I said, and the other document. She said the notary stamp on the other document shows 2:15 in the afternoon. I sat with that. She said a judge is going to look at this carefully. A woman cannot have 2 valid wills executed on the same day. When there are 2 documents, the court looks at the circumstances of each one, who was present, what the person's mental state was, whether there was any undue influence. My document has 2 independent witnesses. It was executed in a professional legal office. Your grandmother was clear and composed, and she said, I want to make sure this one counts. I wrote that down. It is in my notes from that day. She specifically said those words. I want to make sure this one counts. My grandmother at my kitchen table in March with her chicken and dumplings. My grandmother on that porch with the amber light and the hydrangeas coming in. Saying she had taken care of things with the patience of a woman who has been 3 steps ahead of a problem for a very long time. I said, what do I need to do? Renata said, you need to give me what you have, the letter and the business card, as supporting evidence. Then you need to do nothing. I will do my job. When the hearing comes, I will call you. I said, and my father. She said the will names both of you. He will need to be informed and present. That is your decision how to. Tell him. I said I'll handle it. She looked at me for a moment over her reading glasses. She said, "Your grandmother said you would." I drove home to Raleigh that evening with the Bible in the passenger seat. The sun was going down to my left over the fields, and the light was long and gold across the tobacco and the late corn, and I had the windows down and I did not play music. I just drove. The Bible shifted slightly when I took the curves, and I could feel the weight of it moving, and I kept one hand on the wheel and let it. Have you ever had to hold something true for a long time without being able to say it out loud? Hold it careful and private, like a match in wind, just keeping it lit until you found somewhere safe to set it down. Have you ever had the person you trusted most leave you a trail to follow and had to trust yourself enough to follow it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Telling my father was not simple. My father is a man who processes things slowly and who does not do well when the story of what he believed turns out to be different from what was true. It is not stubbornness exactly. It is more like the disorientation of someone who has been looking at a map and is told the road they are standing on is not on it. I went to Durham the following weekend and I sat with him at his kitchen table and I laid it out plainly. The property record, the probate filing, the competing wills, Renata Ashworth, what Bet had told me, and then I opened the Bible and I gave him the letter. He read it very slowly. He read it the way I had read it, all the way through and then back through certain parts. He set it on the table when he was done and put his hand flat on it and looked out the window at his backyard. He has a persimmon tree out there that his wife planted 20 years ago. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "She never told me." I said she was protecting it. If more people knew, it was more likely to get complicated. He said she could have told me. I said, "Daddy, she knew you. She knew you would have said something to Daryl." He was quiet. He knew I was right. He said $67,000. I said 11 years. He covered his eyes with one hand, not crying, just needing a moment of not being seen while he adjusted. I sat there and let him have it. Governor was at my feet, or not Governor, that was Bet's cat. I am just calling up the wrong animal. My father has a dog, a beagle named Huck, who came over and put his head on my father's knee, and my father put his free hand on the dog's head, and they stayed like that for a little while. He said, "What do we do?" I said, "Renata is already doing it. We show up at the hearing and we let her do her job." He said, "And Daryl?" I said, "What about him?" He said, "He's my brother, Loretta." I said, "I know he is, and Mama left him 20 acres and the house. She thought about this. She gave him what she thought was fair, she just didn't let him take everything." My father was quiet for a long time. Huck stayed with his head on my father's knee. The persimmon tree was motionless in the still air. He said she always knew what she was doing. I said, "Yes, sir, she did." The probate court hearing was in October of 2021. The leaves had turned, the particular turning of North Carolina fall that is warm-toned and slow, the maples going first and then the oaks, the fields cut low and brown. Renata met us outside the courthouse at 8:30 in the morning, and she had her files, and she was composed in the way of someone who has done this before and is not uncertain about the outcome. Daryl was already there with his attorney. His attorney was a man I did not know, younger than I expected, who kept rearranging the papers on the table in front of him. Daryl did not look at me when I walked in. He was looking at the table or at the wall or at some point that was not me. I did not look at him for long either. There was nothing I needed to see. The hearing was not what people imagine when they imagine courtroom drama. It was quiet and procedural, and the judge was a woman in her 50s who had the focused patience of someone who has heard many of these cases and understands that the facts are what they are and her job is to find them. Renata presented the will, the witness signatures, the time-stamped log from the morning of March 14 with my grandmother's signature and the two church women's signatures beside it. She presented the note in her case file from that morning, the quote my grandmother had said, "I want to make sure this one counts." She presented a statement from Claudette Harris, one of the witnesses, a retired elementary school principal from Johnston County, who said she had been present in the office of Renata Ashworth on the morning of March 14, 2021, and had watched Opal Lenore Calloway read the will carefully and sign it, and that Mrs. Calloway had been clear and oriented and purposeful and had said specifically, "I want to make sure this one counts," and that she had understood this statement to mean that Mrs. Calloway was aware there might be another document and wanted to ensure the one she was signing was the one that would be honored. Daryl's attorney could not explain how a woman had executed two different wills on the same day. He could not explain why the second one had been notarized at a UPS store 4 hours after the first. He said something about his client's sincere belief that the document reflected his mother's true wishes, and the judge listened to him say it without expression. The judge took 20 minutes. She came back and said, in light of the evidence presented, including the documentation of a previously executed will, the testimony of a witness present at its execution, and the unresolved questions regarding the origin and circumstances of the competing document, I am ruling in favor of the earlier will as the valid expression of the decedent's wishes. She said it plainly and without drama, and the room was quiet, and then Renata put her pen in her folder and closed it. The farmhouse and 20 acres went to Daryl. The back 22 acres went to my father and to me. The Four Oaks account, $67,042, was distributed according to the will, half to my father and half to me. Daryl left without speaking. His attorney spoke briefly to Renata about the transfer timeline and then left. My father sat for a moment in his chair with his hands on the table. I sat next to him. The room emptied around us. He said she won. I said she always was. We walked out into an October morning that was the particular kind of morning that stays with you, clear and cool and full of color, the sky a specific shade of blue that only exists in fall. My father stood on the courthouse steps with his face turned up toward it. We drove out to the back acreage that afternoon. My father and I in his truck. We parked at the fence line and walked through the iron gate, which squeaked on the left hinge the same as it always had. The grass was tall and going dry, the way fields go in October. The creek was low but running clear over. The smooth stones my grandmother had always pointed out to me as a child, saying, "Look how the water has been working on those. Look how long a little bit of pressure takes to make something smooth." The pecan trees were old. They were wide through the trunk and high in the crown, and their leaves were beginning to go yellow, the particular dull gold of pecan leaves in fall. They had been planted in 1955 by my great-grandfather Roy Calloway, who had been born in 1897 and had bought this land in 1951 and had planted these trees knowing he would not live to see them at their full height. He had planted them for the people who came after. My father stood under one of them for a moment. He put his hand on the trunk. The bark was rough and gray and the tree did not move. His hand looked small against it. He said, "Your mama used to shell the pecans out here with your grandmother when you were small, before you were old enough to help. She said it took all day." I said, "I remember helping once. I remember it being harder than it looked." He smiled. He said, "Everything worth doing is." We stood there for a while. The creek made its sound. The leaves made their sound. Two birds moved through the top of one of the trees and then were gone. The field beyond the fence was cut low and brown, and the afternoon light was moving across it the way it moves across flat ground in fall, long and slanted and going fast. My father said she would be glad we're standing here. I said I know she would. We walked back to the truck when the lights started to fade. The iron gate squeaked the same note it always had. My father pulled it closed behind us and latched it, and we drove back to the road. There are things that happened after that I will tell you plainly because my grandmother was a plain woman, and I learned from her. The land transfer completed in December of 2021. My father and I own the back 22 acres jointly. We have talked about what to do with it, and mostly what we have agreed on is to leave it for now, to let it stay what it is, to keep the creek running and the pecan trees standing. The forestry management company that worked with my grandmother came back out and gave us an assessment and said the grove is healthy and the timber value has increased. We are not selling any of it. Daryl is in the farmhouse on his 20 acres. I do not know what his daily life looks like, and I have not been back to the farmhouse. My father visits once or twice a year. He and Daryl speak on the phone. It is not easy and it is not pretend. It is two brothers who love each other without quite trusting each other anymore, which is its own kind of grief, and I am not going to make it sound like anything simpler than that. My share of the Four Oaks account came to $33,521. I put most of it into a low-risk index fund and kept some of it in a savings account. My grandmother would have approved of both. She was a woman who believed in keeping money in places that could be found. The Bible is on my kitchen table right now. It has been there since I got home from Harnett County the night after the hearing. I have not found a permanent place for it yet. I am not sure it needs one. It has its own weight and its own gravity, and it seems to find the right surface to rest on. It is open to the page in Psalms where her grandmother made a small mark in pencil sometime in the late 1930s or early 1940s. There is a word beside the mark that I cannot read. The graphite is too faded and the handwriting is old-fashioned in a way that makes even legible letters hard to parse. But the mark is there. A thin line of old graphite that has outlasted everything that person worried about in the moment she put it there. My name is in the front, in blue ink, slightly smudged at the right edge, in my grandmother's hand. That is not going anywhere. I think about her sometimes, specifically in the way you think about people who left you something real, not just money, not just land, the specific gift of being believed in, being trusted with the truth, being given a trail to follow and told you were the right person to follow it. She knew I would not make a scene. She knew I would not go to Daryl the day after the funeral and accuse him to his face before I had anything. She knew I would sit with what I suspected and go find what I needed and do it quietly and without drama and without giving anything away until the right moment and the right room. She knew that because she was the same way. I think about the porch, the amber light, the rocking chair that rocked a little faster on one side, the hydrangeas after rain, the way she would go quiet sometimes and just look out at the yard at the pecan tree and the long flat field and all that land her father had bought for $2,300 cash and that she had tended and protected and understood for 8 decades. She knew what it was worth, not in money, in staying, in being the kind of family that does not sell or scatter or let the important things be taken away quietly while everyone is looking at something else. She trusted me to be that kind of family too. I set the casserole dish on the counter that night in July and I said okay and I drove home. And I sat at my table with a yellow legal pad and I started from the beginning. And I found what she left me to find. That is the whole story. There is not a dramatic ending with someone getting arrested or a screaming match or a moment where I stood up in a room and said something brilliant. There is just a woman who knew what she had and knew who she trusted and took her time doing it right, and a granddaughter who paid attention long enough to understand what she was being given. The Bible is on the table, it is open to Psalms. Outside my window, Raleigh is making its nighttime sounds. The persimmon tree in my father's backyard is bare now, in whatever season I am remembering this, and the pecan grove in Harnett County is standing the same as it has stood since 1955 and will stand long after everyone in this story is gone. My great-grandfather planted it for people he would never meet. He thought that was worth doing. I think so too. I want to go back to something because I glossed over it and it deserves to be told fully. The week between when I first found out the will had been filed and when I went back to Harnett County, I did not sit still. I worked my regular days, I kept my appointments, I processed the accounts I was responsible for, I answered my emails. None of that stopped. But in the evenings, I sat at my kitchen table with the legal pad and I thought, and I made notes, and I went back through everything I could remember about my grandmother's habits and her preferences and the specific texture of how she spoke and what she cared about. I have been doing bookkeeping for 12 years. What that means in practice is that I have spent 12 years learning how to be very patient with a discrepancy. Most people, when something does not add up, feel a spike of anxiety or frustration and they want to move fast, they want to find the error and close the gap. I have trained myself to slow down at that moment. The discrepancy is information, the discrepancy is telling you something. You do not rush the information, you sit with it until it shows you where to look. The discrepancy in my grandmother's estate was the language of the will, in recognition of his care and service, those words. I had heard my grandmother speak every summer of my life for 14 years and then regularly for another 15. I knew her vocabulary, I knew her sentence rhythms, I knew the way she built to a point and the way she left things unsaid when she wanted them to rest in you rather than be explained. She did not write legal briefs, she wrote letters. She said your uncle was here and the house should go to him. She did not say, I leave the property to Daryl Wayne Calloway in recognition of his care and service. That language had been written by someone else or spoken to her and transcribed or put in front of her at a moment when she could not push back. I did not know which yet, but I knew it was not hers. Here is something else I want to tell you, something about my uncle that I have been thinking about carefully and I want to say correctly. Daryl was not wrong that he had been there. He had been in that house for 9 years. He had driven my grandmother to her doctor appointments and to the grocery store and to church. He had done physical work on the property, repairs on the fence, maintenance on the outbuildings, work that needed doing and that he did. He had been present. I am not going to pretend that he was not. What he did was decide that his presence entitled him to more than it did. He decided that 9 years of proximity meant ownership. He decided that the debt was his to calculate and that he was owed everything. And so he moved, probably sometime in late winter or early spring of 2021, to secure what he had decided he was owed before my grandmother could finalize the arrangements she had clearly already begun. He did not know she had already been to Renata's office in April. He did not know about the timber sales or the Four Oaks account. He did not know about the Bible or about Bet or about the envelope with my name on it sitting between the testaments. He thought he knew her well enough to be ahead of her. He had lived in her house for 9 years and he had thought that was the same as knowing her. It was not. What I think happened, though I cannot prove this part and I want to be clear about that, is that Daryl arranged for a will to be typed up. That reflected what he wanted, and that he brought it to my grandmother at some point in mid-March, possibly as part of a larger conversation about her wishes and her plans, possibly framed as just getting the paperwork in order and that she signed it. Whether she understood exactly what it said, whether she had her glasses, whether she felt she had a choice, I do not know. The Patricia Doyle at the UPS store on 421 is a legitimate notary, and she could not have known whether the circumstances were appropriate or not. She saw an old woman sign a document. She notarized it. That is what notaries do. What I do know is that my grandmother had been to Renata Ashworth's office twice in the spring, that the second visit was on the morning of March 14, and that she had signed her real will at 10:47 that morning and had specifically said she wanted to make sure it counted. She had walked into that office deliberately and she had taken care of her business clearly and in her right mind and in the presence of witnesses, and then she had gone home. Whatever happened at 2:15 in the afternoon of that same day, she had already done what she needed to do. She had been 3 steps ahead of it. That is what I mean when I say she raised me correctly. I am not smarter than my grandmother. I have not done anything she did not set in motion. I followed a trail she left. I went looking because she trusted me to go looking. Every step I took was a step she had already prepared the ground for. I want to tell you about one more moment, one I have not told yet because I think it is the one that matters most. About 2 weeks after the hearing, after the legal work was done and the transfer was moving through its paperwork, I went back to Harnett County by myself. Not to the farmhouse, not to see anyone. I drove out to the back acreage and I parked at the fence line and I walked through the iron gate and I walked all the way back to the creek. It was mid-November by then. The pecan leaves had all come down, the grove was bare-branched and wide and the light came through the branches in pieces. The creek was higher than it had been in October, a good late fall rain had come through and it was moving fast over the stones, clear and cold. I could hear it before I could see it. I stood at the creek for a long time. I did not pray exactly. I am not a church person the way my grandmother was, which she knew and did not hold against me, but I stood there and I let myself feel what I had been keeping careful for the past 4 months. It was not triumph, I want to be honest about that. There was no part of it that felt like winning. There was something more like a long breath, like a room being returned to the right temperature after it had been too cold for a long time, like a column of numbers that finally resolves. She was gone. She had been gone since July, and this was November, and I was standing at her creek on her land in the bare November light, and she was not coming back. The $67,000 was in an account with my name on it, and the 22 acres had my name on the deed, and none of it was as important as the fact that she had known I would come here. She had trusted me with the most important thing, which was not the land or the money, but the truth of what she wanted and what she believed and who she was. I stood there until I was cold. Then I walked back through the pecan grove and through the gate, and I latched it behind me and I got in the car. The Bible was on the passenger seat. I had brought it with me. I am not sure why, maybe because she had kept it beside her and I had started to understand why. I picked it up and I opened it to the front page, my name in blue ink. Loretta Me Calloway, June 3, 1987, her handwriting, the ink worn and set from 37 years of this page being turned past. I have always been in here, I am going to stay in here, that is something no one can take from you. She had said that to me when I was 9 years old, sitting at her kitchen table, showing me the family record in the Bible the way her mother had shown her and her grandmother had shown her mother. She had said it plain and certain, the way she said everything that mattered, not to comfort me but because it was true. I closed the Bible and put it back on the seat. I drove home to Raleigh. The sun was going down behind me the whole drive, the late afternoon light in the rearview mirror, and the road was flat and straight through the tobacco and soybean country, and the fields were cut low and the sky was big above them. I thought about Bet Simmons sitting with that Bible in her back bedroom for a month, keeping it for me, understanding exactly what she was keeping and why. I thought about Claudette Harris driving to Dunn to be a witness because Renata had asked her to and she believed in the work. I thought about Renata Ashworth filing that contest notice 8 days after the competing will appeared, moving quietly and correctly and without any instruction from me because my grandmother had thought that far ahead. I thought about all the women in that story, including the ones I never knew. My great-grandmother Nola Jean Pickett, born 1899, who had put a small pencil mark beside a verse in Psalms sometime in the decades before I was born, and whose handwriting is on those pages still. Women who wrote things down because they knew the writing outlasted them. My grandmother wrote my name in a Bible in 1987, and she kept that Bible on her nightstand for 34 years. And when she knew she was running out of time, she put it with Bet and she put a letter inside it and she wrote my name on the envelope and she trusted that I would find it. I found it. That is not the end of the story because stories like this do not end cleanly. Daryl is still in the farmhouse and my father and his brother speak on the phone and it is what it is. The land is in the right hands now or as right as it can be. The truth is on the record. That is what she asked for, that is what I gave her. The Bible is on my kitchen table. It is open. The fan is running and the apartment is quiet and outside the window Raleigh is doing what Raleigh does and the world is continuing to move. I reach over and I touch the page in Psalms where the pencil mark is. The paper is cool and thin and I can feel the slight ridge where the pencil pressed in all those decades ago. A woman I never knew stopped here and thought something worth marking. What she thought I cannot know, maybe she cannot know now either wherever she is, but she stopped here. She was present, she put her mark down. I think that is all any of us can do, stop where it matters, put the mark down, trust that the right person will find it. My grandmother trusted me, I hope I have earned it.